There you go.
Hello, folks. Welcome. My name is Charles Ogletree. We've got a wonderful panel that you'll hear more about. Johanna Wald has been working with me since the beginning. How's that? Is it a nice way to put it? Since the beginning.
Since the beginning.
Yeah, I won't say how many years that's been, but we've been very happy to do it. And this is, as you can see, a very important event for us because the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute has been around for a long time. And if you have a time for a tour, it would be great to see his photograph. It's in the Harvard Library. It's in my office. And you'll see the bust also in the library of Thurgood Marshall, his mentee, a person who made a big difference from him. And I'm very happy to be introducing this. There come some more friends. Hello. This is a very important program on education and social justice. And what's amazing is that when you think about South Carolina and you think about the issues of race and justice, what's happened around the world and certainly around the country, it's not a surprise for anybody in South Carolina what's happening there. And we've seen it hit from the East Coast, from California to Illinois to Chicago, different parts of the cities in Chicago, all the way to the East Coast, to Baltimore, to Washington, here in Cambridge. And it's good in the sense that it reminds me, and many of you who are my age, of the things that Dr. King did in the 60s and the 70s and how important it was to have those movements. All the laws changed, but we see in many cases, as you'll hear today, a lot of things are going backwards and not going forward. And so I hope that you'll enjoy this presentation. It will be by a scholar who has degrees from every place in the South, right? You think of schools, PhD, anything you think of that he's gotten it, and I think that's very important. And I think that you're going to hear more about him, more about the Institute, the program that he's working. I spoke in South Carolina. He's been here. And there's a wonderful friendship, a wonderful relationship as well. And so I hope that you will join me in welcoming our visitors and also be supportive of the thing that we're having here on education and social justice. That's going to be very important. Thank you very much.
Good evening and welcome again to the second Biennial Symposium honoring the enduring legacy of Charles Hamilton Houston. He was, of course, a great civil rights lawyer and scholar who on this day in 1895, he was born 120 years ago. My name is Lamont Flowers. I am the Distinguished Professor of Educational Leadership and the Executive Director of the Charles H. Houston Center for the Study of the Black Experience in Education at Clemson University in South Carolina. In collaboration with Professor Ogletree and Dr. David Harris at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute, I am delighted again to have the opportunity to moderate this symposium with two special leaders and scholars who have contributed significantly to how people think about educational opportunities, civil rights, and of course, race in America. The theme of this second biennial symposium is education and social justice in the 21st century. Of course, the goal of this panel-based symposium is to discuss the complex issues associated with civil rights, educational opportunity, and inequity in educational outcomes. The goal here is to sort of consider the scholarly literature to some extent, but also the everyday experiences of American citizens as it relates to these issues. Educational equality, law enforcement disparities, and the relative impact of these issues on our schools, on our families, on our communities, and of course, most importantly, to some extent, the future of our democracy. The first panelist is Johanna Wald. Johanna Wald is the Director of Strategic Planning at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute. Prior to joining the Institute, she worked with the Civil Rights Project, where she served as the Senior Development Officer and Policy Analyst. In that capacity, among other things, she conducted research on issues related to school discipline, dropouts, and criminal justice policy. Also, the intersection between educational policy and criminal justice policy, which is very important for tonight's symposium. The second panelist is William Smith. Dr. Smith is the founding executive director of the National Center for Race Amity, Wheelock College in Boston. Under Dr. Smith's leadership, the National Center's programs really promote insight into the moral and scientific truth that all individuals are innately equal. Therefore, his research considers the impact and the importance of cross-cultural and cross-racial collaboration in America. The primary goal then, another goal of this symposium is for us tonight to conceptualize and consider and even contrast the following questions, some of the following questions. So in terms of the complex relationships between educational equity and criminal justice, where do we go from here? How has the recent surge in tragedies against unarmed African Americans challenged our notion of democracy in America? And what are the consequences of law enforcement disparities, underperforming schools, lack of achievement on America? At this time, I would like to invite Johanna Wald to provide her initial statement and remarks. Then Dr. Smith will come forward to provide his remarks. Once both opening statements have been presented, I will return to the podium and facilitate a question and answer period. So I kindly ask you to please refrain from asking questions until the question and answer period, but I promise you we will have plenty of time for that. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Johanna Wald.
Well, thank you so very much for coming here today, and I really want to thank Professor Ogletree for giving me the privilege of working with him for this past decade, and it truly has been a privilege. I want to thank Dr. Flowers for working with the Institute and sort of putting together this symposium and this collaboration, which has been really exciting for us to look at these Houston institutes from all over the country and work together. And I want to thank Dr. Smith for being on the panel, and I feel like I'm a little bit intimidated by the company that I'm keeping. So I want to just sort of give you a little bit of a background about what you're going to get from me, which is a bit of a hodgepodge. And when I worked at the Civil Rights Project before coming to the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute, I did a lot of work on what we called at that time the school to prison pipeline. And at that time, it was just sort of beginning the notion that there were these kind of different trajectories for different students, and that students could actually be funneled from school kind of into prison was a sort of new concept. And so we helped to organize with the Advancement Project the first conference on zero tolerance, looking at the racial disparities in zero tolerance policies. And then later on, we organized a research conference on the school to prison pipeline and started to kind of pull together the research base. Since working at the Houston Institute, more of my work has really focused on the criminal justice system. And the ties and the connections between education and criminal justice are so strong, and they come from so many different directions, and the policies are so interconnected that what you're going to get from me is a bit of a hodgepodge. It's some research from some economists, some sociologists, some ethnographers. It's a way for me to start, it's the way that I started to kind of make sense of this issue, and to try to understand it from both the ways practiced on a daily basis to what are some of the policy opportunities. And especially right now, I think this past year when the public really seems to have opened its eyes to some of the very deep disparities and the very different ways in which children of color often attend school and later live their lives. There seem to be some real opportunities to really look at how criminal justice policy and educational policy can possibly kind of be more deeply connected and can actually work together. So kind of bear with me, and we'll see where this goes, and then we'll see what kind of questions you have. All right. So there we. No. All right. So just bearing in mind that this institute is named after Charles Hamilton Houston, who once said that all our struggles must tie in together and support one another. And at the institute, we really we take that very seriously, and we look at the ways in which, particularly educational inequalities and some of the inequalities and disparities that we're seeing in the criminal justice system are interconnected. So we're examining the deep connections between educational engagement and attainment and criminal justice involvement. And then at the end, we're really starting to try to devise some of the ways in which these reforms might be interconnected. So I'm sure you've heard this before. I'm going to start, sort of on the deep end. Our criminal justice system, or our U.S. incarceration rate, has increased approximately eightfold since 1980. So between the 1920s to the 1970s, the rate had been relatively stable at about 100 per 100,000. And as of 2008, and it has not gone down since then, the rate has climbed to approximately 762 per 100,000, which is enormous. And I know you've probably been reading about this. This probably comes as no surprise. Why this kind of huge astronomical skyrocketing had been relatively hidden to a lot of the country is because it's not been in any way evenly across the populations enforced. What we've seen is the inequality in penal confinement, and this is Bruce Western, who I'm quoting here. The inequality has produced extraordinary rates of incarceration among young African-American men with no more than a high school education. For these young men born since the mid-1970s, serving time in prison has become a relatively normal life event. So here's just a chart that you can see of the percentage of men aged 20 to 34 in prison or jail by race and ethnicity and education between 1980 and 2008. So you'll see in all categories, white, Latino, and Black, the rates have increased. But you'll see really in relatively small proportions for whites who go to college, who have college education, and even relatively small, although larger, for Blacks who have college education, where you see this just absolutely huge astronomical increase is among Black high school dropouts. So that's where the prison population has really been concentrated. And so the risk of imprisonment is for those born in 1975 to 1979 cohort, if you are a high school dropout and you're Black, your risk of imprisonment is 68%. Again, you'll see that it's gone up in every category between 1945 and 1949. But where you see these just absolutely just astronomical increases is in this rate of relatively uneducated young Black men. And they have borne the brunt of these tough on crime policies. So what are some of these connections that we can see? So failure to graduate from high school, triples the likelihood of being imprisoned. 68% of state prison inmates did not graduate from high school. Around 60% of Black male high school dropouts born between 1965 and 1969 had served some time in prison by the early 30s. Students who are suspended or expelled from school are almost 3 times as likely to be in contact with the justice system the following year as students who are not excluded from school. So what are some of the contributing factors to failing or dropping out of school? Poverty, exposure to violence and trauma, environmental hazards, poor access to health and mental health care, lack of nutrition, overstressed families and parents, lack of preparation for kindergarten. So you see this kind of vicious cycle happening. Failing behind academically can lead to severe behavioral issues, and exposure to violence and trauma can lead to severe behavioral issues, which then increase the likelihood of being suspended, expelled, and or arrested in school. And at the same time as this sort of huge increase and spike in the numbers and percentage of individuals who are sent to prison happened, so did the numbers of students who were suspended, expelled, and arrested in school. I'll go into that in a second. But what are the roadblocks to high school graduation for students of color? And as you can see, graduating from high school, particularly for youth of color, is a huge kind of achievement or sort of transition that they need to make, because the risk, if you don't make it through high school, then your risk of imprisonment is so high. So toxic stress from living in high poverty neighborhoods, a rise in the exclusionary disciplinary practices, which I'll get into a second, particularly in secondary schools, disparities in economic opportunities, and lack of support for English language learners. This is all research, by the way, that is not coming from me. This is coming from really well-known researchers, and I'd be happy to kind of provide you with those sites later on. So, is zero tolerance to blame? Students who are suspended are at increased risk of academic failure and disengagement from school. That's not so hard to figure out. When you get suspended from school, you miss out on class time. You're kind of isolated from your peers, and it begins this kind of disconnection that you have from school. It's also psychologically, there's a feeling of not being wanted, of literally, and there's a term that's been used called push out, where you feel as if the school system is kind of actively trying to get rid of you. So then it becomes easier to not be in school. So there's this kind of vicious cycle that goes into. But look at these skyrocketing suspension rates, exacerbated by race, which are not dissimilar to the imprisonment rates that we saw at the kind of the same time period. So between 1972 and 1973, again, across racial groups, there's sort of an increase for everyone, although there was a little bit of a dip there for white students. But the increase for black students went from 6% to 16%. Whereas you see, an increase for white students from 3% to 5%. So these kind of zero tolerance policies are affecting everybody. They're increasing the overall numbers, but you see these just large disparities among who is being most harshly sanctioned in school. Pushed into prison, you've got 40% of students who are expelled are African American. 70% of students who are arrested in school are African American. Black students have 3.5 times as great a risk of being suspended as whites, and we already saw that once you're suspended from school, that sort of begins this kind of disconnection cycle. And 2 times as many Black and Latino students are not graduating, which all kind of leads to the 68%, where you see 68% of prison inmates do not have a high school diploma. At the same time, we saw an increase in the deployment of police in schools, which was a little bit ironic because that sort of movement to put police in schools was really spurred on by these really high-profile school shootings, which mostly took place in largely white suburban schools. And yet it's the large urban schools with large populations of students of color who have really seen the largest increase in the deployment of police in schools. So nearly 70% of those schools now report a police presence. And what happens as a result? More children are in court. As school districts consider placing more police officers in school, there's this surge in criminal charges against children for behaviors like, in Massachusetts, it's disrupting a school assembly. And disrupting a school assembly can literally be flicking a rubber band. Assault can be shoving a kid in the hallway. It really depends on who's interpreting the rules and who's there to see them. And there's such a huge disparity between the way some of these behaviors are being treated in schools with no surprise. Schools with large numbers of students of color tend to treat these kind of behaviors much more harshly than sort of, large white suburban schools where you very rarely will see an arrest take place in school. But I did some interviewing in focus groups with school resource officers across 16 different districts in Massachusetts. And what we found was the amount of discretion that these officers have to decide what to do is enormous. They virtually have no guidelines. They virtually have no supervision, and they virtually have no accountability. So you had some great school resource officers who cared about the kids and were very caring, and they got involved in basketball games, and they played, and the kids liked them, and those kids were really lucky. And then you had some schools where these resource officers were sort of by the book, zero tolerance, and just depending on who they were, sometimes what mood they were in, what they knew about those students, these life-changing decisions would be made about whether a kind of a shoving match would mean they'd stop the students, they'd make them shake hands, they'd send them back to class, they'd stop the students, they'd send them to the principal's office, they'd arrest the kids, and they were up in juvenile court for assault charges. One study actually showed that the number of students that are suspended and expelled has much less to do with the behaviors than with the attitude of the principals. If the principals took a very strict sort of zero tolerance approach to behavior, there were, large numbers of students suspended in school. If the principal was a little bit more like, okay, I'll only do this as a last resort, not so much. So there was the discretion of the adults in charge in these school discipline cases is enormous. And the difference really can make a huge difference in a child's life between where they end up and whether an incident ends up in court and subsequently kind of changes their pipeline experience. So this is an economic study, and I'll just get to there's all kinds of, numbers here, but basically what Lance Lochner found, and this was backed up by another economist, is that a 1% increase in male high school graduation rates will reduce the number of crimes committed each year by 100,000 and save the country $1.4 billion annually. It's a 1% increase in the number of male high school graduates. When I first saw that, I said to myself, doesn't that make high school graduation a public safety priority? Isn't that where, funds should be going? I mean, if we're saying that simply graduating more males from high school is going to reduce the number of crimes that are committed, shouldn't that be as much of an investment kind of priority as more police on the street? So that's where, this economic study really kind of got me thinking about, and, certainly I'm not the only one, about how these policies are so intertwined. So the average saving, and this is another study by two other economists, but with very similar kind of findings, is that the average savings per year for a new high school graduate is $55,000 for a black male. For a male Latino, it's $38,000, and the average overall savings per year per every new high school graduate to the country is $26,600. Most of these come from lower incarceration costs, but there are also substantial savings from lower criminal justice costs. So here are the numbers. As you can see, there's the average 26.6, but you can see kind of how that breaks down male, female, and by race. So this is the work of a man named Robert Balfons, who's at Johns Hopkins, and he has coined the phrase, which you may have heard, called dropout factories. And what he's found is that there are these limited numbers of schools in the country that graduate less than half of their ninth graders. Okay, so when you think about that, less than half. Imagine if you all go to your children attend the ninth grade and have them say, well, less than half of their peers are going to be in graduation 4 years later. I mean, that is kind of unthinkable, I think, for a lot of us. And so he really looked at what's going on, what happens between ninth grade and 12th grade, and where are we losing these students? Where are they falling out? And what he found was the most treacherous time for young African American and Latino men is between ages 11 to 21. At the very moment that they're most developmentally vulnerable, the response from schools, from foster care, from the healthcare system, and child protective services get weaker, while the response from the justice system gets stronger and harsher. So just as the services are sort of falling away, the criminal justice system is sort of swooping in. And so their middle and high school experiences become make or break. And he found that most students who eventually drop out can be identified as early as sixth grade by what he looked at was this: attendance, A lot of these students just stop coming to school. By their behaviors, a lot of these students are getting suspended, and by their course performance, they're falling behind academically. So those 3 indicators in 6th grade can tell him who's at risk of dropping out. So look where it got me. This is a man named Ronnie Casala who did a number of interviews with prison inmates, and what he wanted to do was find out what their educational experiences had been. And this is sort of one example. He said, "I like to fool around in school, but I also liked school. But then I fooled around too much, and that got me into a program, so he got expelled like 2 hours a day at the library. I hated it. The teachers were like, 'I hope you learned your lesson,' and I did. I learned the slightest thing I do, I'd get booted. So I was pissed. I mean, really pissed. They didn't think I'd be bad again, but I was worse. And look where it got me." So that's sort of one example of the way in which the kind of school system might have been able to kind of step in. And Ronnie describes this as their experience school is a series of movements and a dizzying shuffle from place to place as they pass through various programs, facilities, or boot camps, and finally prison. So he kind of saw that for a lot of these young inmates, it was like school was just this, they were here, and then they were sort of pushed over there, and then they were kind of pushed over there, and then it was just this sort of shuffle where they got kind of closer and closer and closer to prison, and then, prison. So Robert Balfon says what he's called the dropout factories. 33% of blacks and 24% of Latinos do not graduate on time. Now, let me say in 10 years, the graduation rates overall in this country have gone up and increased quite a bit. And there's been a lot of very good work throughout the country in schools to really look at these factors and try to increase graduation rates. So this is a problem that's very much on the radar of many people, and a lot of schools, to their credit, are really working very hard to kind of identify these factors and start to raise the graduation rates. And there is some serious accomplishment that can be pointed to. Overall, the rate has risen, but you still have these pockets where there are very few increases at all. Half of the African-American boys who veer off the path to high school graduation do so in just 660 of more than 12,600 regular and vocational high schools. So it's really a very small kind of segment of schools that are producing the kind of vast majority of these dropout factories. And he identified the traits. They're largely, typically very big high schools, hyper-segregated by race. They're concentrated in 15 states. Many of them are in major cities, and a lot of them are in the South, in Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina, which also tracks the prison rates. So what do we do about this? I mean, given this information, to me, this is, as I said, this is sort of information coming from a lot of different sources, but, how do we start to realign and look at how do we create more high school graduates, less crime, and less prison, and greater investment in our youth, in building them up, and less in building more prisons? So here's a few things that we know. Schools can also be incredibly protective factors. Attachment to school is one of only 2 protections from exposure to risk factors for violence. So those students and youth who grow up with a lot of risk factors who are exposed to violence and trauma, if they're attached to school, that actually protects them, and it sort of keeps them safer. Students who feel, quote, connected to school, this is a huge longitudinal study about connectedness. And they found that students who feel connected to school, who say they feel a connection to school, are less likely to use substances, to engage in violent behavior, to experience emotional distress, or to become pregnant. So over a whole host of sort of risk factors, students who are connected to school are kind of protected from a lot of those risk factors. And they found that what was it that students felt kind of made them connected to school? It was feeling like their teachers cared. And they also, when they perceived the discipline to be fair, caring, and relatively tolerant. So schools actually can exert an enormously positive value and effect. So Balfont's came up with, based on his kind of looking at what are these critical factors, what are the risk factors, what do we know about students who are at risk of dropping out, what can we do? And he came up with this idea of this Marshall Plan. So if we know that dropouts are largely concentrated in this relatively small number of high schools or schools, and we know what the risk factors are, we know that we can identify a lot of those risk factors really as early as third grade. And a lot of teachers will tell you, a lot of teachers will say, they'll identify these kids that they feel like are at risk, very early on. So what would a kind of civic Marshall Plan, and there are a number of planks to that, but these are just a few. Grade level reading. So the research shows that proficient reading by the end of third grade is an important predictor of high school graduation. Now I know that there's kind of an urban myth that they predict prison beds by reading levels in third grade, but I think that's false. I've heard that so many times and nobody can really get at the kind of source of that, but there is this sort of myth going around that's how they predict the number of prison beds that they need is based on third grade reading scores. Later on, the chronic absenteeism. Research shows that chronic absence is an early warning indicator of a potential dropout. And these are two ways that you have early absence. You have the students who act out and end up getting suspended and expelled. And then you end up having a much quieter kind of student who often kind of passes under the radar, but are equally at risk. And those are the ones who just, they don't make trouble in school. They just kind of quietly kind of start to withdraw and stop coming altogether. And they're often the harder ones to reach because they just sort of quietly creep away. He has something called an early warning indicator and intervention system that, that schools are starting to implement so that they can start to identify these students. The middle schools, this is really big. The largest predictor of dropouts is dropping out is whether you have to, you're held back in ninth grade. Ninth grade is like the big year. And I mean, that's your transition into high school. It's a huge transition. It's enormously difficult for a lot of students. And that's where a lot of students, because in Massachusetts, it's made harder by the fact that they're the 10th grade MCAS. And so a lot of schools start the practice of holding back kids who they think aren't going to do well in the MCAS in order to up their testing. But in fact, that's like the worst thing you can do for a struggling ninth grade student. The worst thing you can do. It might seem to make sense. Okay, we'll hold them back. We'll give them another chance at ninth grade. That is like the absolute worst thing you can do to a ninth grader. You create these overage students who do not want to be there, who feel like they're being held back and they just stop coming to school, or they act out and they get kicked out of school. But instead, what Balfont's is suggesting is this Marshall Plan is to really provide intensive transition support for struggling students, get them up to speed in 8th grade so that by 9th grade they're okay, and get them, get the 9th graders, give them whatever it is they need, give them the intensive kind of remedial work that they need so that they can keep on going. So, and there's two things about that. There's the academic support, but there's also just plain old emotional support. The definition of resilience is sometimes just having one adult in your life who cares about me or believes in me. And that can be the difference for a struggling student, really. A very simple thing. Is there one student? Is there one adult? Is there somewhere in that school who cares enough about that student to support them? The other planks are kind of this pathway to college and careers, and also finally a dropout recovery, which is to re-engage. There are 6.7 million 16 to 24-year-olds right now who are disconnected from either school or work. So they're not in school, they're not working, and they are at enormous risk of being kind of just scooped right up by the criminal justice system. So a kind of massive dropout recovery program. And we have a number of really good ones in Massachusetts, which I'm going to go into next. So this is where I think there are some kind of interesting policy implications to some of this. Justice reinvestment, I don't know if any of you know what it is, but it's a program, it's a data-driven approach to reduce prison populations. And what happens is the Pew Center comes in to a state, they have to be invited in by the state. You have to have the governor, you have to have the district attorneys, you have to have the legislature sort of all decided that they want to figure out how to safely reduce the prison population in that state. They invite them in, they do this kind of data-driven process looking at where are the prison entries, where are they coming from, what's going on, why is the population so large, and then what are some of the remedies. So initially, and then based on those, so the reason it's called justice reinvestment is that then those set of corrections or whatever revisions are in theory passed by the legislature, and then the money is reinvested. So there's money that's saved by reducing the numbers of individuals in prison, and that money is reinvested in some of these programs that will lead to increased public safety. That's how it's supposed to work. It doesn't always work that way, but this process has been undergone by over half the states. Massachusetts I don't know if you guys read about it 2 weeks ago, the governor and the state legislature and the judicial branch just announced that they're going to undergo a justice reinvestment process. They want to focus on rehabilitation and on reentry, on what happens. Why does Massachusetts have such a large number of individuals who return to prison after they've been released? My belief is that we need to expand this justice reinvestment and look way broader than that. That's an important, but there's so much more that we need to look at as a state. And number one, I think our number one goal should be stop having so many people enter prison in the first place. But they haven't asked me. Anyways, there was a critique of justice reinvestment that was done a couple of years ago, and one of the quotes was, "We believe that through smart, targeted, and locally determined reinvestments, we could aid substantially in repairing the destructive impact of high levels of concentrated incarceration on poor communities of color." So, my question is, can educational interventions become part of these smart, targeted, and locally determined reinvestments? Education has never been part of the justice reinvestment process. It's sort of seen as a strictly criminal justice. District attorneys are involved in, sometimes defense attorneys get in there, but probation gets in there, parole gets in there, the judges get in there. Nobody sees education, and yet we've just seen these kind of really deep connections. And so what are some of these investments? So in Massachusetts, we happen to have some really interesting programs. We have trauma-sensitive programs where teachers and administrators are trained to understand and recognize the signs of students who have been traumatized, and to begin to create environments that are sensitive to that trauma. And in fact, a lot of the behaviors that end up getting students kicked out of school, sometimes they're hyper, it is actually the result of having been traumatized. So they're sort of on hyper alert all the time. And they kind of see danger a lot, and they need certain kinds of environments. They do much better when it's a very safe, supportive, calm kind of environment. So you can actually create environments that are much more helpful for students who have been traumatized, much easier for them to learn. So when teachers who are working in schools with high numbers of students who have been traumatized learn what are some of those behaviors, and they don't necessarily mean that that's just a bad kid who acts out, or a kid who doesn't listen to me, or a kid who's not interested in school. In fact, there's a lot going on in that child's life. They create a kind of trauma-sensitive environment. So that's a very promising program that's been around for several years. We have restorative justice practices going on here, where instead of suspending and expelling students, you actually have them sort of look at meet up with those people that they've harmed by their actions, and they devise corrective actions, and they actually take responsibility for their actions. But they stay within the school environment. They're not kind of just thrown out. They're connected, and that is what students need more than anything. They need to be connected. Isolating is, the worst and most damaging thing you can do. And we have, so there's the trauma-sensitive schools. We also have these wonderful kind of dropout recovery second chance programs that are leading the. All right, I don't know what happened. We have two in particular that are national leaders. One is ROCA, and ROCA works with. young people who are already court involved. Many of them have actually been to prison. If they haven't been to prison, they're very close. And it has an incredibly kind of intensive way of working with these youth where they find them. You know, they go out on the streets and they find them. They bring them into these environments. They understand that a lot of these youth have a lot of trust issues. You know, they come to their homes. They kind of won't let them go. You know, and they bring them slowly into environments where they not only are kind of getting their education, but they're also getting vocational training, and they're just giving an enormous amounts of kind of personal attention and relationship building and helping these youth think about, one, how do you even begin to think about for them having a job, and what does that mean? And they give them these kind of supervised jobs so that they can act out a little bit and fail before they actually go into real jobs. And they just kind of work with these youth for a couple of years. And this program has been heralded all over the country. It's now part of a kind of investment strategy that's being used, where if they can produce certain amount of successful outcomes, they get more money given to them. So, I mean, and it's a very intensive program, but it's also cheaper than sending people to prison, as are all of these programs. And ultimately, what you produce is contributing members of society. And we also have Youth Build, which is another great program that both kind of brings a lot of the youth who have been court involved, kind of brings them in, teaches them affordable housing skills. So they build housing in their community. So they become, you know, members of the community. At the same time, they go back to school. At the same time, they get their GEDs. And at the same time, they're kind of part of a community. And there's another United Teen Equality, which is a really strong program in Lowell as well. And a lot of these programs have they have some basic common denominators. One, they kind of combine vocational training, job skills with education. But mostly they're really about kind of building a community, a sense of trust, and very strong relationship building for adults, for youth who are really not terribly trusting of adults and have had a lot of trauma and disappointment and tragedy in their lives. So that's kind of where I'm going to stop. I think that right now there seems to be in a lot of states a lot of interest in either justice reinvestment or similar kinds of things. In California, I don't know if you heard, they recently passed an initiative where a number of felonies were changed to misdemeanors, and it meant the immediate release of a certain number of inmates, which reduced the population. And those funds were then reinvested, in one of the initiative requirements was that they go to education programs. I think just saying education programs isn't enough. I think we need to kind of really pinpoint what some of these education programs will be that will actually, work very closely and are deeply connected to the likelihood and risk of incarceration. But I think that that's a very promising development, and one where we might be able to join some of the education and criminal justice knowledge that we have. So that's my spiel. Thank you. Should I take questions? No questions. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Johanna. Thank you very much. I'm just going to slide this laptop back a little bit so that I can get some space here. Well, I too am grateful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, Lamont. And I assure all of you that it has nothing to do with my being from South Kakalaki, as Lamont hails from down at Clemson. Just for a minute to underscore a couple of things about, these were really wonderful statistics and insights into what's happening within this country, but in terms of the world picture, where we stand, I mean, And it's not just in our minds, and you're not, the people who come up with the statistics are not just making this up, compared to other, quote, developed countries or leading nations, civilized nations, notably France and England. Our rates are exponentially higher in terms of incarceration. 10, 15, 20 times higher. So there's something wrong with this picture, and this is not just being conjured up, out of people who want to make a complaint or who are liberal or whatever else people might say. On that note, I would be remiss. I do a lot of editorializing, but there's something I've got to start off with that I'm concerned about, and I just have to put it out here before I go into my spiel in terms of this particular symposium. And I just hope that you'll examine it and be conscious of it. In 1938, Germany, they began to build an intense feeling of nationalism. A certain leader targeted a certain group of people as a displacement for the frustration and social ills. I was extremely upset that 2 weeks ago, a couple of young thugs here in town beat up a homeless Hispanic guy and boasted that it was a part of the bravado of taking back America a la Donald Trump. They targeted him. He doesn't belong here. He's a homeless immigrant. And I have to say this to you, friends. Let's be watchful that new immigrants don't become today's targeted group, because that's how they are being set up. Please share a vigilance, a concern. And don't poo-poo it, because people did poo-poo it when it happened to so many others. And sort of, it's not. This is serious stuff. These people are people who are coming here to seek a better life, as so many have had in our history. And they're being squared away in a very special little place. So I had to share that. I had to get that off my mind. I wanted to do several things. I wanted to share a little bit about the National Center for Race Amity as a part of actually my presentation, because I think it's so vital to repairing the ills that have been so wonderfully laid before us in terms of statistical data. This word amity, in the center, I founded it 5 years ago at Wheelock through a grant from the Kellogg Foundation. And why amity? Sort of an odd word we don't use a lot. It's becoming increasingly used. We think maybe the center has something to do with it. But the thought in terms of amity is this. The word is friendship, of course. And we know that change in our society rests in human relationships. That's really what it really gets down to. We the people, we constitute the society. And what is the relationship between people? In the hierarchy of human relationships, at the very top, we hold, in terms of dear relationships, family. We all love our families. even those crazy people in our family. At least I have some in mind. You might say, well, you got that cousin or brother, maybe, or, whatever, who does really some stuff, and you have to come to the rescue or do something to assist, and you do it because they're family. You got to do it. On that hierarchy of human relationships, next comes what? Friends. Friends. And in fact, in some situations, we love and care for friends at the same level or maybe a bit above from family members. I love that sister like she's my real sister, as much as I love my sister. So the pragmatic, simple South Kakalaki view of these human relationships is that to the extent that we can create cross-racial, close cross-racial, cross-cultural friendships is to the extent that we can promote permanent, lasting change in society. People die for friends. People do anything. Think about your best friend. The other thing about friends is they'll tell you when you're wrong, if they're a true friend. So we place a premium on cultivating and giving opportunity for people to develop close cross-racial, cross-cultural friendships. Now, it sounds nice, but at the same time, what is the evidence of the power of friendship? We maintain at the center, we subscribe to the thesis of the other tradition. Some of you may not be familiar with the thesis, and I'll just give it to you very quickly. It was announced and developed by Dr. Richard Thomas, who's Professor Emeritus of History at Michigan State University. And admittedly, Richard is my mentor. And Richard says to me, he says, Smitty, don't be telling people I'm your mentor. It makes, they think I'm old. I said, Richard, you are old, brother. So, but Richard really did an examination of the effective movements in American history that have advanced access, equity, and permanent change with regard to social justice. And in each instance, he's able to trace it back to close cross-racial, cross-cultural collaboration and friendship. The progressive movements of this nation are seated in race amity. Going back to abolitionist days, pre-abolitionist days, civil rights movement is seated. So there's a model and a productive example, by the way, in terms of just a little propagandizing, with the center is working on a film for public television, An American Story, Race, Amity, and the Other Tradition, where we historically examine, going back to the settlement in 1605 in Northampton, Virginia, where there were cross-racial, a community. It's fascinating. We'll go into all that. But it's to present this other tradition. And we say the other tradition because we're all very familiar with the tradition of racism in America. The racist tradition, you can just chapter verse cite it. But in our history, factually, there has always been a parallel moral counterweight to racism. Every time, every place, every incident. there has been a parallel pushback, a moral counterweight to racism. And that is the other tradition. The racist tradition, the other tradition. And we need to examine that, because a lot of that has to do with these issues and the complexity of these issues, which brings me into talking about the aspect of this symposium and the complexity of it, and what are some ways to get our arms around it? How do we approach it? And what should we be looking at? Well, to me, one of the most important things is the narrative. That sets the stage. And I guess it's beautifully stated. This is a pre-publication book, and you'll hear much about it, Understanding Mass Incarceration. Hasn't hit the press yet, by James Kilgore. But it's a primer that charts what's happened in America in terms of mass incarceration and how it got to be to the status that it is, and all of the abuses and the inequities that are incorporated in it, how they came to be. But importantly, Kilgore points out that much of it rests in how the narrative has been framed. And I want to just share a couple of things to sort of draw a circle around that. The first narrative, in terms of this particular topic, was a narrative of a policy analysis to claim that the nation's educational system was in crisis. Among the earliest expression of that narrative was the sentiment in the report, the National Commission of Excellence on Excellence in Education. And it was titled, A Nation at Risk. Some of you will remember this. I do. I was in graduate school then, but maybe some of you weren't born. But there are a few of you out here who remember this report. A Nation at Risk, The Imperative for Educational Reform, which was published in 1983. And the report contended that U.S. education system was falling behind those of many other nations, and that tighter measures of discipline and more rigorous testing were required to improve the performance of American students. So that report set up, that was one narrative back in 1983. A second narrative was spawned in the famous War on Drugs. And it spread this narrative spread the idea of the ideology of criminal justice being a remedy, criminal justice presence in public schools being a remedy for some of the ills that exist. And the third, of course, was a spinning of a narrative that we all recall, and it did so much psychological damage to people, our nation, and certainly the people who were the victim of it. And that was the narrative that was spun out of the Central Park jogger incident. Now, it was more than just 6 men of color, young men of color whose lives were ruined and who were basically, they were framed. It's more than that, just that injustice. Because the greater narrative gave way to that idea of the super predators, which is really scary for the society. And so that reinforced the idea of imbuing criminal justice across the board, and particularly in those urban city schools. So that narrative, those three things we're actually living out right now. I mean, it's still among us. It's still having an impact that's affecting all of these things. Another narrative, and just to give another example outside of this, this one that's personal, right? And I get emotional personally about it, was the narrative that McNamara spun about Vietnam. And then the guy had the nerve to get on television on a documentary film late in his life and apologize for the lie and the narrative that he had spun that cost the lives of so many young people and friends of mine, both here and there, because I served there. The power of the narrative. So I suggest that as we look at the things that are happening and create strategies around how to counteract them, that we keep an eye on the narrative and how it's being spun. Now, there's hope for that. And thank God for the internet and social media, seriously, as it has allowed for the opportunity to those other than the traditional information gatekeepers to shape the narrative. Exhibit A is Black Lives Matter. Okay. It's helping shape the narrative, which has not allowed the lies that normally are spun, not tested, not thought about, forgotten about, to be contested, to be exposed, and then sometimes shown in living color. So there is a tool available, and it's being used, and I'm so happy. I see the young women like Patrice Cullors and Issa Rae. I mean, those are the new SNCC people. And some of you, hopefully everybody knows what SNCC is. They were the avant-garde, we're going to get this done, and we're going to be in the face of injustice no matter where it is. And so they're out there doing it in that way. So funny, I was at a symposium on Martha's Vineyard with Issa Rae, and I was attending. We both were there. Yeah, and Danny Glover, and this guy, somebody challenged about, Black Lives Matter. Are you challenging everybody? You're not challenging Hillary. And so Patrice said, oh yeah, we are. And so sometimes people say that, and it's like a passing statement. Sure enough, that night on TV, most of you saw it, where they cornered Ms. Clinton with Black Lives Matter and put her on the spot and ask her those hard questions that they promise indiscriminately to ask any and all candidates. So a lot of this is about the narrative. Now, I have and the center has a different emphasis on how we want to influence the narrative. There's a tremendous amount of work and activity, scholarly work, activism that's going on to deal with and countermeasure these statistics. We're sort of taking the long view, and not because the long view is the easy view, but at some point we've got to look in the future, 20 years from now, and see how we impact and can shape things that make a difference to those statistics. And we're thinking that fundamentally, and maybe sounding oversimplistic, that we need educators, and those of you who are educators in this room, that we need to begin to shape the narrative very differently at the very early ages of preschool and first grade. And what is that about? You know, to be as smart as we are, and we are smart. We are smart. For the life of me, I don't understand why, as educators, we don't teach children what a human being is. There's nothing in curriculum in education that teaches basic facts about a human being. And hence we're all walking around, even those of us in this elite institution, saying stuff like, I got Irish blood in me, or I got Cherokee blood in me, which is totally bogus. I mean, just totally bogus. Without fact or anything, we're ignorant because we aren't taught fundamentals about what a human being is. I want to draw that out a bit to illustrate the power of what I mean. Those of you who have children or don't have children but are around them, nieces, nephews, whatever, and you know that learning process when they're like 4 or 5 years old and you're giving them the number values and the ABCs and picking out all the little words. And my kids, you know, we play the game A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L. You know, you sing the little song. And then to trip them up, you know, you'd be singing it A, B, C, D, E, F, Q, R, P. And my kids, oh, no, Dad, it's not that. It's A, B, C, D, it's E, F, G. Because they had gotten it down and understood it. So I couldn't trick them. Or we do the number thing. 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 plus 4 is 8. 8 and 8, 16. 16. And then somebody say, you know, 10 and 10 is 15. Dad, it's not 15. It's 20. You know, it's 20. And conceptually, they understand. Kids, young children, will as easily internalize the fact and the knowledge that there are 4 blood types that's shared among all of humanity. In that any later foul works that are thrown at those concepts will be rejected roundly. It's just not true because a person is this color or has that hair texture or has that facial feature, is smarter, dumber, slower, faster, meaner, kinder than anyone else. And believe me, children do internalize that. And I make a confession, and I've done this a lot, I mean, sharing, because one, it looked like sort of a knucklehead in it, but it's important because my kid learned from it. I was riding down the street with Louis, my son, when he was about 11. And I just made an offhand comment to my wife. I says, you see those brothers over there? I said, I think one of those guys, the guy with the pink shirt on, he's related to so-and-so. So it was just a casual comment. So Louis said, Dad, Dad, you always teach us that we're one human family and that mankind is one, that all people are equal. But you only call the black guys brothers. You say that everybody's brothers. I'm like, oh. But that's the power of starting and engaging that kind of instruction. Another piece in that process, in terms of on the education side, is that we have got to get out of siloism in education, which is doing terrible damage to our young people and to our system of values. Because, see, people make these decisions that result in these numbers. That people, we the people, are making these decisions. And their frame of reference about who people are is what is drawn on in making these decisions. There's a lot of the damage of siloism in terms of creating an opportunity for young children to have self-worth, because it's proven over and over again that self-esteem is an important factor in a student's academic mental health. How they feel about themselves. Who am I? What do I bring to the table? And so we constantly, and not with intent, but it's sort of just this rote kind of, ditch that we're in. And I get in a fight every year at the National Association of Multicultural Educators. Be out there this year and get into other fights, good fights, not, but taking them on, or not them, some of the folk, we have in our curriculum, we have multicultural curriculum. Most schools do. It's multicultural. But when you examine it closely, sadly, what we have done, African American, Hispanic, Asian educators who have been key in shaping that multicultural curriculum, we emulate the Euro model. It's all about us. It's all about us. It ain't got to do with you. We're going to talk about black people because black people haven't been talked about for so long. I understand that. But another narrative, and a more effective narrative for all kids, and particularly for our society, and for making the change that will come about when they become decision makers in this society, rests with this. Here's one example. Harriet Tubman. Harriet's taught now in third grade. She's introduced to third grade children. The great freedom fighter, heroine, Harriet Tubman, brave, courageous. And so 2 years ago, I was at NAME, and I said, I said, who all teaches Harriet here? Yeah, praise Ann. I said, well, how many do you talk about Thomas Garrett? Some of them said, well, who is Thomas Garrett? Some of you are probably saying the same thing. I'm going to tell you just a quick little story because it's important to this process. It's not a story. No, this is fact. Thomas Garrett was a white Quaker, Pennsylvania, wealthy. Started a business, moved over to Delaware. His family still lived in Pennsylvania. Very involved in the abolitionist movement. Worked closely with William Still, the noted black caretaker and liberator of recently emancipated slaves. When they came across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, into Philadelphia, William Still's job, he was the resettlement guy. He'd say, hey, you might want to head up to New Bedford, Massachusetts, as he did with Frederick Douglass. Or he might suggest, tell you where to go to get a job, or find some people who would be sympathetic. And so that was his task. But when Thomas Garrett was a young guy, his family, a very wealthy family, they had servants who worked at their home. And some of us sort of, ooh, servants. Yeah, like the people who come in and clean your house once a week. That kind of thing. Nothing, no lower status, whatever that relationship is. Imagine that's you, Thomas, and those are the people who came and worked at the house, which it was that situation, that relationship. And he got to know them quite well. Young boy and a young girl his age. Then one day, a la 12 years a slave, catchers came, grabbed the daughter of the servant family and took off, going to claim that she was a runaway slave. And Thomas and the brother, they saw the wagon that they'd taken away and had a wobbly wheel, and it was in the wintertime, so they could follow this wagon in the snow because of the right rear wheel was wobbly. And so, yeah, they chased it down. They were in panic, anger, scared. They got her back. Fast forward, Harriet Tubman comes to the Quaker Meeting House, one of the Quaker Meeting House, to talk about her work, and her, specifically, not just her work, but that her family was still in bondage and she had only been able to free a few people. Thomas Garrett got it right away. He got the hurt because his friend had been taken. So he says, they immediately bonded. When you read and see some of the letters that went from Thomas Garrett to William Still about Harriet Tubman and this personal friendship that they had, I mean, just like you would your best friend, well, I saw Harriet last week, but she hasn't come back. I'm really worried about her. And she told me this was happening. Have you seen her? Joyous news. Harriet came by. We had a great time. Da, 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 da. Now, over the course of this relationship, in 15 years, Thomas Garrett housed 2,700 runaway slaves. Not 2,700. That's a small city. Much of it on this relationship. Now, and it was a wonderful, we're talking about this in the film. You got to show this. But here's the point. Little kids in a classroom, black, white, and brown. I'm teaching Harriet, and I'm teaching Harriet only, and the black kid is feeling good, as he should be, or she should be. Brown kid may be feeling a little something through a diasporal relationship. White kid ain't feeling nothing. Just as I didn't feel anything when I was getting the all-white heroic history when I was a kid, or any of you who may have had that experience. How much more empowering to young minds in the third grade to see that people actually cared about each other and had close cross-racial friendships. How powerful is that? And so I get upset when I say, well, kids are denied that knowledge that gives them a framework of how people have interacted in our history. So fast forward that kid through a number of other experiences tied in with understanding what a human being is, and you get a new kind of, sort of a different kind of thinker, a different kind of a human relationship. And you start to get, frankly, a different kind of society. Because there's just all of this prejudice, we know. We say, yeah, it's based on ignorance and lack of knowledge. And it's based on how the narrative is being written. I'm going a bit long. I want to just fast forward to get off of that and come back to some positive reinforcement or examples that bear out some of the statistical data that was shared earlier. Are any of you familiar with Call Me Mister? It's housed, Clemson University, man, that place has changed in some very good ways. I'm a storyteller. When I was in high school, Clemson, me and 3 other guys were the first blacks to play football in the Atlantic coast. We went to Wake Forest. And I grew up in Greenville. And Clemson's in the next county, but it's just a hair's throw, and they claim Greenville is the big city. And Frank Howard was the coach at Clemson. And they asked Frank Howard on the NBC stage, they said, Coach Howard, they got all those Negroes that going up, one of them, that R.C. Gamble boy, they sent out to the University of San Francisco, and that Butch Smith, that Bill Smith boy, he going to Wake Forest. You think you're going to hit some blacks down there at Clemson? Frank looked right into the camera, didn't blink. We'll never have a nigga at Clemson. I mean, it was not unusual. That was just a fact that he said it. And then I come and I see that your institution now, which is a powerful thing about change. For people say things can't change, it's going to always be, you're not going to, yes, you can change, and things do change. And not only is the wonderful work you're doing there, but Call Me Mister, which is one of the most effective, dynamic programs in terms of preventive education for young black and brown boys, comes out of Clemson University. And essentially what the program is, it focuses on creating elementary and middle school teachers from young black men. And they're up into the hundreds now with the number that they've graduated in the Call Me Mister network. And statistically, we know what the results is. We know the evidence. And I'm hoping, frankly, that, because it's spread to about 9 states now, I'm hoping that Call Me Mister is a model that's employed here, just because it is so powerful and so effective. I'm going on I'm going to stop now, sort of scattered here and yon, but please feel free to ask either of us any questions you might have. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our panelists for the very, very informative discussion. Hopefully, it encouraged you to think about some things that perhaps you could do in your homes and communities and schools and families, and even pursue some solutions, perhaps, in a way that really ensures that all Americans can reach their highest potential. This is the hope. At this time, we will open the floor for questions. I would ask that you would please come to this microphone here if you have a question for the panelists at this time.
If you got any tough questions, she's got it.
Yeah. We'll consult.
Thank you for all your hard work in trying to make the world a better place for our children and grandchildren. It's not working. We know it's not working. I've been working at it for 50 years. I was a graduate of Harvard Law School in 1971. I worked as a juvenile public defender. I worked for EPA until Ronald Reagan was elected. There was no more EPA. Mm-hmm. I've worked for the last 30 years as a math teacher. I've seen the METCO program here. Mm-hmm. It has not improved one bit the relations between blacks and whites. The bitterness is there. No one is listening to the professional teacher. Profession of teaching has turned into being a cog in a wheel. Don't make waves. It's not a pretty picture. I don't know what will make a difference other than maybe revolution. But if it gets worse, what other advancement, progress could possibly be made? Look at the homelessness. Look at the imprisonment. Look at the hopelessness of large segments of our population. No one's listening to you and me. They're going on their merry way, and we are nothing but slight bumps in the road. I feel great about my legal practice, and I feel great about my educational practice. And I had an impact on the juveniles that I represented, and I had an impact on the students that I taught. It's a drop in the bucket. Look at the national politics now. Look at what people are doing in jumping on Donald Trump's bandwagon. We're in trouble. And I'd love for my grandchildren, who are my greatest joy, and I spend my time now that I'm retired with a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old. It gives me great pleasure, but I'm not real optimistic.
Well, let me. You haven't asked the question.
But that is the question.
Let me respond. Let me just respond to a couple of things that I must respond to. One, I understand your frustration, but I think it's unfair, the picture that you paint, for example, of Metco. My son-in-law, who is a Metco student in Newton, is now, he worked for DCF he is an MSW. He's worked with kids in the city. He works with the alternative school in Boston. Any of the kids I call him a kid, he's a grown man, but who've gone through the Metco program, who are doing substantial things that are affecting kids' lives and people's lives, would take real issue with saying that program has not had an impact. I'm not going to go back. I'm giving you facts, but individuals, we're a society of individuals, and to the extent that Damon, my son-in-law, had worked with DCF, he's now in a school, the lives that he impacted in that potential pipeline, I think is significant. So I'm just saying.
How much progress we have made with women's rights and homosexual rights. Look at how little progress we have made with the word you use, racial. It's not racial. There's only one human race. You said the same thing. Why do we keep using the word black race, white race, Hispanic race?
Maybe you want to. Yeah.
No, I'd rather you answer.
No. I just want to reiterate. I understand I know that, but you're expressing frustration. But as we express, I'm just being very blunt as I am. That as we express frustration, we have to be sensitive and concerned about others. People in Wellesley. In fact, Damon's cousin Andy. Is Aaron. Aaron is a vice principal at Wellesley High School. Went through the Metco program, but he now works there and is an image for all of the black kids and white kids. See, that's that positive thing where you see people so you can't say to me, and I just think it's to paint a brush that, the Metco program is a film, saying, well, there's a high school in Wellesley that has a black assistant principal, he'll probably be principal one day, and these white kids and black kids are seeing him, that's affecting their lives. And he's there, and he'll tell you point blank, I had an opportunity in Wellesley. His brother, incidentally, Andrew, is the first black football coach at Williams College, who went through the Metco program. But I'm saying, and he's affected. So all I'm saying, and I don't want to dwell on it. So I'm just saying, I understand what you're saying about we haven't advanced to the extent that we like to. But there's certain sensitivities to others that I have and that we should all have, and just, don't lump them in there because it's not fair. That's all.
It made a great difference to the individuals who participated and succeeded.
Yeah.
It did not make a great difference in the last 50 years. I went to a mixed high school in New York.
Thank you for your question and comment. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
So can I just say one thing about that? And I just want to kind of respond to a piece of that, in a very small piece. And I actually find that the past year, I think as painful as it's been for the country to confront, I feel like there's hope in that, just because it feels to me like, as someone who's been looking at racial disparities in like criminal justice and education for 10 years and mostly been met with a big fat yawn most of the time. And, most of the time, I think among other whites, people go, oh, come on, things are getting better. Look, we have a black president, blah, 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 blah. This is just, suddenly it seems to me that people are stepping up and noticing and paying attention. And I don't know where that's going to go. Is that going to end up being ultimately lead to better lives, more equal? I don't know. I think the jury's out. But frankly, I find some hope in the fact that I think more of the country is stepping up and noticing and paying attention and admitting, because I just think white America generally has been in massive denial for so long. And I think that's been a lot of the problem, is that civil rights movement happened in the 60s, took care of everything. Prejudice doesn't exist anymore. There are laws about that now. Everything's good, and and that's the narrative I think that you've talked about, that somehow we constructed this narrative that it's just about individuals, right? And if you're poor, it's your own fault. It's just because the rights are there. I think as a whole, this last year, as painful as it's been, I think people, and again, maybe it's anecdotal, maybe it's just people I know, are starting to sort of notice that there's a great deal of work that has to be done. And I find some hope in that, and I don't know where that leads.
I think
but
I'm just referring to.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, no, I know, and yeah.
Harper's has had in their index that a year ago,
yeah,
they were asked what
that's right. Yeah.
Likes with their positive racial equality, race relations,
yeah,
likes it 38%,
right,
64%. And then 1 year later,
yeah, it's changed. I thought that was profound, that poll, actually, because to me that indicated there's a recognition that we're not where we thought. A lot of people thought we're not post-racial, obviously.
And that didn't come about because of any of the efforts that we were making. It came about because people
were watched.
Social media,
that's right.
Had an opportunity to see for themselves.
Okay.
And now
you've got to let other people go now.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Do you have a question here?
Yes, thank you. Jay Jordan, I'm over at the Ed School. 2 questions. One, Johanna, you talked about toxic stress and the impact of that in one of your slides. And my question for you is, toxic stress isn't just created in schools. What are the systems communities can use collectively to help lower that toxic stress so that children can learn? And if I could just ask my second question, then you both can respond. Dr. Smith, you spoke about the narrative, and you ended with this, powerful story of Harriet Tubman and Thomas Garrett. And again, I think for you, what are steps that educators can make or do that can change that narrative in schools? You went through many different stories, and you spoke about a conference that you're going to, but some of those messages are not either getting to people that are writing the curriculum or getting to teachers. But it's a very powerful point, as just at the Ed School, we're talking about how kids relate to what they're learning and how important that is. So just what are steps that you think that need to happen as kids are sitting in classrooms not relating to what's being taught? So either of those.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the toxic stress.
You go first. Yeah.
And my colleague David Harris is going to be so happy because you just kind of opened up for us to. We actually have a project that we're about to kind of launch called the Houston Marshall Plan, which is essentially looking at what the Marshall Plan was post-World War II, and thinking of communities that have essentially been disinvested in, right, for the past 40 years, that it's been a pretty deliberate policy of disinvestment. What happened after World War II was these kind of massive amount of resources were put into rebuilding those communities, but they came from, the important part of it was that they were locally driven initiatives. It wasn't sort of from the top down in terms of what these communities were supposed to do in Europe to rebuild. The initiatives came from the community. So our sense is that within communities, there's this enormous amount of really exciting, interesting programs, projects, ideas, creativity about what to do, and that the folks within these communities know better than anybody else what their communities need. I mean, just one example is just Mothers for Justice and Equality, which was started in Boston, and it's a group of mothers who have lost children to street violence. And they have taken that tragedy in their own personal lives and created this amazing organization that's doing leadership training in the schools, that's making mothers kind of these powerhouses in these communities to addressing violence. And now, folks in Ferguson were calling them up and wanted them to come out and help them figure out how to create a similar organization in Ferguson. So I think within communities, if we can start to identify some of these community-driven, programs based on people who have lived in these communities, who know what their communities need, and somehow bolster those and kind of raise those up and amplify those and figure out ways to get those funded. That may be, I agree with you, no school is an island, and these schools are only going to survive if they have a strength of a community around them, and the strongest schools are the ones that reach out to the community and have all kinds of community supports coming in there. And so that the school becomes a kind of centerpiece for a much larger community program. So that's...
Yeah, I'm really happy I'm really happy to hear you talk about the community and pulling them in and getting their frontline definition of the problem, which interestingly conjures up another model that historically we're not familiar with, and that's the liberal hillbilly Miles Horton down at the Highlander School down in Tennessee. Him and Septima Clark, black woman from Charleston, South Carolina, actually fueled the information, or not the information, fueled the process for the Freedom Schools in SCLC. And Andy Young and Dr. King, they all acknowledged that. But their model dealt with that approach that you're talking about. But talking about education and how do you impact it and change it, first let me just say our bandwidth at the National Center for Race Amity is very narrow. And we articulate a lot of things, but our capacity, we can only focus on 2 or 3. We're longing and wanting someone to take on the mantle of developing this idea of having a human being curriculum as a part of the educational process. Somebody has to do that. Some fine institution has to do that. It's such a vital, vital element. And how can we stand to sit in ignorance of that and just say, well, when we know that it's critical to the shaping of minds and attitudes and views of people from one to another. In terms of day-to-day process, we're trying to, again, pick with our bandwidth, pick those things that we think we can impact. And one of them, we're high on the narrative and trying to impact it. So we're hoping that this film project that we're working on now will have some impact. It's not a panacea. It's not going to get to everybody everywhere. But to the extent that these stories of the other tradition are adopted, used, included in curriculum, not just the ideas that we come up with, but that teachers come up with to expand that content, can have a profound effect. I mean, Eyes on the Prize, which is now just almost standard curriculum in so many schools in the nation, we know that narrative has really impacted education. So we're trying to impact the educational process through, to the extent that we can, contributing to changing the narrative. And so that's what we're doing, and we're happy to talk to people about how we enhance that and get more people involved in it, because that's the way it's going to happen. But we have to realize that we're living out a 200-year plus narrative, and we're going to change it quicker than it normally would be because of the power of social media. But it's still going to take a while. It's just going to take a while. Because first of all, most of us have got to be gone from here. You know, I'm and the younger people come in and move it much further than how we've moved it. And that's why I was saying I was just so happy when I was listening to Patrice and Issa Rae talk. And I said, yes, there's hope, there's fire out there. I'm sorry.
You have another question?
Hi, my name's Abby Burke. I'm at the college. So my first question for Professor Wald. So I can see the connection between high school dropouts and then later going to prison. But I was wondering whether you thought the connection had more to do with the emotional risks of not finishing school or the kind of economic aspect of poverty and lower opportunities after school.
Yeah. Good question. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. My second question for Professor Smith, when you were talking about the narratives and how it's changed in the prison system, I was wondering what you think of like 3 strikes laws and the way that we've started kind of being very prejudicial against people on parole, the stories that have come out in the news of people on parole committing crimes, and then states creating laws to kind of counteract that. Do you think that's becoming part of our narrative of incarceration right now?
I think that's a really good question about the high school dropouts, and it was actually when I was thinking about it, as I was looking at these statistics and the kind of, and I think it's complicated, and I'm not sure I really know the answer, so I'm just going to kind of, I think there's the simple fact that by virtue of graduating from high school, you have options open to you, that job options, right, future training options, that there you can go on, and it's kind of in this society, I think, a very baseline requirement that gives you certain vocational options that are going to potentially economically allow you to kind of function without having to commit any kind of crimes. And I just wonder whether the fact of, I think about this, the fact of simply graduating from high school means at some point there was either someone, at some point you had to make a decision that you were going to finish, and it's not that easy to do in a lot of circumstances. It's not like, in my family or what, it was never, there was no question that you weren't going to finish high school, right? It wasn't even an option. You would have had to work really hard to not finish high school, right? Where I come from. But that's not true. So I think by virtue of the fact that either at some point, they made a decision that they were going to finish there was someone in their lives who cared enough about them and had enough confidence in them and that does seem to be, the research is pretty clear that if you have even one person in your life who believes in you, that's often enough to kind of keep you going. So, I wonder whether just the sheer fact of graduating means that there was someone in your life who, but the research on Lochner is pretty clear, because I went back and looked at that today just to make sure, and it's not just that your risk of incarceration goes down, but literally the crimes committed. It reduces the number of crimes that are committed, violent crimes. So they actually found that was kind of rape and assault that were the two biggest that went down as a result of graduating from high school. So what that actually means, I'm going to leave that to you to figure that out. But I'm not sure, but it does. There is this actual. It's not just risk of being incarcerated. It's actual crimes committed. So,
in terms of the 3 strikes, and I think did the president try and make some adjustment to these felonious records of individuals who had been incarcerated? There was an executive order to reprieve.
46.
Yeah.
46 made it through.
Okay. Yeah. But the consciousness of it is there. But it all ties back again to the narrative. And that's just an extension of the super predator narrative that's still being played out. And I can't help but think that the prison complex lobbies, because it's a business. It's a serious make lots of money business. So there's vested interest in supporting the narrative and lobbying people, lawmakers, to enforce these laws that really don't make sense even in our personal lives. I mean, think about it. Things that you do or you did within your family, and the warnings you got, I mean, boy, if it stopped at 3, we'd all be in deep trouble, But so the idea, this harshness, the end game, and the crimes that they're oriented toward. Again, Michelle Alexander, that whole thing has been painted out beautifully in the new Jim Crow, but that's an extension of the narrative, and it's going to take a long time to change that. But I think it can change.
I mean, a lot of states are pulling back from 3 strikes, and California kind of modified it. It was actually Massachusetts, ironically, liberal Massachusetts, that passed a 3 strikes law a couple of years ago, bitterly contested. It was a very controversial law. And we were at the time really going against the kind of tide of the rest of the country that was actually pulling back from those kind of laws. I think in a lot of ways they've been discredited because, you hear these stories about somebody going to jail for life for stealing a pizza. I mean, they're just so rigid. So hopefully I think we'll see a kind of pulling back from the worst of the worst of those.
But and race and class play a huge factor in that.
Huge. As in with
as soon as
mandatory minimum.
And this is and I say this tongue in cheek. As soon as there's an outbreak of white kids running around stealing stuff and getting caught, and going to jail. I mean,
look at that.
That's what I'm saying. I'm like, I'm sitting there, and I think it's wonderful, this whole attack on trying to remedy the drug abuse problem in the Commonwealth. I do think it's commendable. But I'm saying, where the hell was it when the preponderance of kids were people of color?
Yeah. I mean, that is the most blatant.
That's the classic.
Suddenly you can't incarcerate your way out of our current heroin crisis. And I'm like, because it's happening to your neighbor, because it's it's in your neighborhood. And suddenly now it's a public health issue, which is great. I'm all in favor of it being a public health. But again, where was this 20 years ago when it was all about lock 'em up and mandatory minimums and, that is a huge example of how an issue changes.
The narrative
changes dramatically. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. We have another?
Hi, my name is Gavin Reynolds. I'm also a freshman at Harvard College.
Welcome.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for your time. Thank you. But I do have 2 questions. Number one, Dr. Wald, this is more toward you. In your presentation, you talked about the statistics and the need for teachers and administrators in the low-income communities to perhaps think about being more lenient in their punishments. And I was just wondering if you knew the demographics of the teachers who have been enforcing those harsher punishments. Are they black, white? What race are the teachers? So that's my question. My second question is, you talked about how both at home and at school, those environments can affect what's going on. And I was wondering, with so many of the variables out of the family's control, what can actually be done at home to combat those situations?
So the teaching force is overwhelmingly white everywhere, and I know that's what the call me Mister is kind of getting at. So by and large, it's mostly white teachers teaching in predominantly children of color, and there are problems with that. It's not exclusively, and often when we did, it was interesting because I did focus groups with teachers, and and this is just our focus groups, but whereas like a lot of times the white teachers would talk about students in terms of, well, that one's going to prison, and that one's headed for, and I want to give the mandatory maximum to that one, because the black teachers didn't sort of talk about their students in that way, but they were still fairly punitive, a lot of them. So it wasn't like, it wasn't a kind of either or situation. But they didn't talk about their students in the same way. They were more like, they were punitive, but they were kind of like, those are my kids. And it was a different orientation. Anyway. So I forget the second part of your question.
Oh, no, I was just asking about at home, what can be done, even when so many of the dire situations are out of their control, what can actually be done at home?
It was something I forgot to mention early when I mentioned Call Me Miss in terms of programs that really try to address outside the classroom support and remedy for these challenges. There's a wonderful program in Savannah, Georgia, Parent University, where this guy who was a plumber actually started Michael O'Neill, black guy, plumber, and just neighbors and people in the projects and all the difficulty they were having with expulsions, suspensions, and all this. And he says, well, dang, the parents are really, they don't have a clue as to what's going on for whatever their problems are and their issues are, and there were plenty of them. So he chose to go in and try and create a vehicle by which parents understood what the educational system was about and to become engaged. It's a tremendous model. He might be somebody that you want to, in terms of your model, your community thing, to investigate. Yeah. We're trying to get Michael up to our national conference, which this is a wonderful time for me to make my commercial, Lamont. We're having the National Race Amity Conference, November 19th and 20th here in Boston. And the focus is on media and education as pertains to the other tradition. And some of these people will be there talking about all of these issues. So there's information here about that. But Parent University, to be specific. So when you get a chance, Google it. And if you shout out to Michael O'Neill, says, Smitty said I should contact you. Seriously, Smitty said I should contact you. Okay.
But I just want to get to one more point about the difference between when you have a largely white teaching staff and they're teaching mostly kids of color, and that's where the kind of implicit bias can sometimes kind of kick in, and there's a lot of research about how unconscious bias affects our, and what the research says is actually we're often driven by our unconscious biases more than our explicit values. So even if we believe ourselves to be free of bias and free of prejudice, and that's something that we feel really deeply about, we can still hold these kind of unconscious biases. And I think often in schools you see this kind of suspension spike around middle school, and I think that's often when the kids get big. And I think I think often if you have a largely female white population of teachers, and you have a lot of older, larger kids of color, then that can kind of trigger fear among teachers, which makes me think that might be some of the reasoning behind the fact that these suspensions tend to spike around middle school, much more than in elementary school. And I mean, that's one of the theories, and so people are looking at the kind of role that implicit bias may be playing in some of that disparities.
I'm sorry. But they also spike. That middle school age is a critical age. I was a middle school principal for years, and I should say I liked it because the kids are goofy and I'm goofy. Yeah. But that, in terms of human development, the brain literally is one of the last growth spurts in the human brain, and emotionally, psychologically, moral values, permanent moral values and leanings are internalized and developed in middle school at that time. And the cruciality of that, though, what it is accompanied by, is an intense sense and concern for a sense of fairness and justice. And any of you who have kids, I have 4, they're all grown now, but I can remember it was in that middle, that 13 to 15 age, it ain't fair, Dad. It's not fair. I mean, it was always this sense of what's fair and not fair. And you get the kids pushing back, and it's a fact that children have a built-in crap detector. No, it's a fact. With teachers, they know when you're full of it. And they sense it. And these kids, many of these kids sense it. And that physiological development and that moral interest is like, it ain't fair, man, and I ain't putting up with it, so I'm going to call you up, whatever. I mean, that's when it happens. And all those considerations have to be taken in place. And that's a part of the educational challenge for teachers, for preparing teachers. So,
thank you for your question. It looks like we have 2 more questions.
I'm a former retired, over 32 years in the Boston Public Schools.
At the Taft?
I had been there 4 years.
Okay.
16 years at Charlestown High School. That's where I retired from.
Okay.
I like your T-shirt.
Yeah. I found that not only was teaching in the system dangerous, suppressive, oppressive, and consequently depressive. However, I did acquire a platform to teach my students to think well of themselves and that they could excel. Now, my question to both of you is, you spoke about parallelism.
I'm sorry?
Parallelism. Mm-hmm. Something happening simultaneously. And yes, it's going to take a while. But can't we do something now to work with the new teachers that are coming into the system? We still have quite a few older teachers that are still there, that are struggling, being pushed out, et cetera, et cetera. We need that experience. What they have done, they have separated the young from the old. No business does that. Okay? You need the experience of the older teachers.
Absolutely.
But they don't want to see our children, regardless of color, excel and be a productive person in this society. And that is really what is going on. It's dragging this country down.
When you say they, who do you mean?
The system.
Okay.
I mean, any teacher will tell you this. If you try to really invest in the student, they try to hurt you. Physically sometimes, and psychologically. And if you get out of the system alive, you're lucky. That's how bad it is. And I've only taught in Boston. And it's blatant. They did nothing after Garrity died. Nobody pushed. They just let it go. And you're right, the community and the parents. But we have such a different community now in Boston with a lot of new people. And by the time those parents find out how terrible the system is, their child has either dropped out or moved on. And they're afraid to speak up. And so now we have so many young parents that have gone on with their lives. A lot of them have been incarcerated. So you see this redundancy. So that is embedded fear. Embedded fear. So they don't say anything or go downtown and protest or whatever. So I just wanted to, my personal experience. I taught English for over 29 years, and then I taught Black history. And I did 4 big Black history shows. David Walker, Harriet Tubman, emulating those people, using teachers and students. But they really tried to sabotage my efforts, but I still put the shows on. So it's just, not just me, but overall in the system. And this is what people really don't know. They have no clue how bad it really is, and how little and lack of affinity. My other question is, how do we help teachers understand the different cultures and develop more of an affinity for these children? It's got to be in here.
Thank you.
Let me answer your part of your question was about older teachers being kept from younger teachers. You should, if you're interested personally, or anyone else here who's a retired teacher, Wheelock College at the Aspire Center has a program that is doing exactly what you're talking about. It's recruiting. It even reached out and says, hey, we even have a small stipend for retired teachers. They want you. Contact Aspire, man. They're looking for retired, seasoned, experienced teachers, particularly who've taught in urban centers in Boston, because that's who they're trying to pair them with. So that's a thing I always strive to create a balance, because everything has a balance. And Boston also has some outstanding high schools. Tech Boston Academy is one of them. Poorest zip code in the city, highest homicide rate in the city. 95% of the kids go to college. Hello. I got to say that. And then the dumps, and we can name them quite a few of them. But I'm saying there are, and the problem is, and a lady raised this at a thing years ago from the Department of Education over at the African. She says, what I don't understand, because it was about, this is the time they were fighting about who could get into Latin and whether or not it was discriminatory or not discriminatory. And she said, well, why do we create a society where there's only one Latin? I mean, if those are good places and we got enough people, why don't we create 3 or 4 of them? Why don't we create 3 or 4 Tech Boston Academies? There's something, and it's a part of us, not just those bad people, but a part of what we buy into in terms of our values.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sometimes of elitism.
Absolutely.
So anyway, I'm sorry.
But what you're saying about loving the kids, I've been just talking to people who are running some of these programs, and I always ask them, what's the single biggest thing? And they said, if they could, they said exactly what you just said. If you could somehow teach adults to love these kids, and value them, and really, and it does seem so basic, but I don't know. Can you teach that in teacher ed? how to love the students. Can there be
It's
a course?
an attitude. It's an attitude.
No, it is, but it's and it's kind of meeting them where they are and who they are, and really kind of getting a kick out of who they are.
But you also have to remind them of what happened 40 to 50 years ago that brought us to this point, 40 years of non-education, lack of education, under-education. You see, that has to be taught in the education departments so they know from whence all of this came.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have one more question. This will be the last question of the evening.
Hello, I'm a sophomore at the college, and I study math and physics. But
Yeah, I like the way y'all say at the college.
That's
cool.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
but,
Doug. That's cool.
First, I would like to say just thank you, Professor Smith, because you're very articulating the things I've been feeling all my life. Making friends with people who look different than me has meant everything to me. So thank you for your words there. But my question is, I was wondering if you could give your perspective on a situation I encountered when I was student teaching last year in a high school that has been discussed. What happened was a fine student got into an argument with his teacher, who I was working under, a white teacher.
This is at Tech Boston?
This is not at Tech Boston.
I thought you said a school that's been named because I said
Boston Latin?
You
can't say. Okay.
I'm sorry.
So the student, he was a fine student. Yeah. He got in a big fight with his teacher. She called the school police to come take him away. Yeah. He was a high school senior, and he was perfectly innocent. I knew him pretty well. And the police, they grabbed him around his throat and started dragging him out of the classroom. And I was wondering, if you were in my shoes, as 18-year-old helping out in the classroom with calculus problems, what is the ethical responsibility? Like, what would you have done in this situation, knowing? I know you weren't there, but I'm wondering any thoughts on that situation.
You're saying he was perfectly innocent, meaning he didn't
he did nothing besides disagree with his teacher.
With it, and so she called the policeman, and they
and this is one of several situations.
Yeah. And so was that student?
I'm just wondering whether to be silent in the classroom is a reasonable thing for me to do in that kind of disgraceful thing happens.
Well, I don't think so. I disagree. Not that I'm disagreeing. I'm talking to her right now. My suggestion to you is that you speak up and you say what you saw, and it can put. See, this is something that you will be able to draw on later in life. These are one of those pivotal points about who am I? Who am I in terms of what I espouse and what I believe. And sometimes as young people, we have to make some really, really tough decisions. And you're sort of cast in that situation. We're cast in that situation later in life. Well, I have daughters who teach in the Boston public schools. One of them saw out of her window this other teacher bait a kid into hitting him. And then he threw the kid down, da-da-da-da-da. And so, despite all of her colleagues, she says, oh, hell no. No. Blank, I saw you. And he got suspended. He's not teaching anymore. And yeah, she was a pariah. Who does Kaylee Smith think she is? And blah, 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 blah. And she said, Dad, I can live with it. So, but I've seen her be empowered as a woman about other issues, drawing on the fact that she made a tough decision. And I talk about it lightly, but this was a tough decision, man. I mean, you're talking about your colleagues. You might have to see the person again because you're out of there. You're in there doing some tutoring and stuff. So you might, I won't see you again. But here people are. So we have to make moral choices sometimes And that's for your own heart to know. Okay. But I guarantee you, when you make tough moral decisions, it can empower your life.
You're talking about after the incident.
Yeah, not.
He was asking the moment.
No, you're talking about after the incident, right?
After the incident, you want to report. There's no question. At the time, it's not her fault.
No, I thought,
I didn't understand.
I thought your question was
let
after.
her speak.
Sorry.
Did I misunderstand what you were
answer.
asking?
You gave a great answer. That's exactly what I was
did you?
hoping to
That's what
understand.
you were. If I missed your question, I don't mind.
You did not.
Yeah.
Oh,
Thank you very
okay. So
much.
I did understand what she was saying.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And thank you for your question. Please join me in welcoming, thanking the panelists.
Thank you. Thank you. This is cool.
And thank you all for your participation. This concludes the symposium. Good night.